Saquon Barkley and Quinyon Mitchell have pretty good odds to win both the Offensive Player of the Year and the Defensive Rookie of the Year, but just how likely is it?
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, my everydayers? Welcome on into yet another edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. And I'm your host, Gino Camilleri, joining you on this Wednesday edition of the show. And we got to talk. Is Jalen Hurts overpaid, underpaid, or is it just right? The Eagles have a game against the Bengals. Is this the most anticipated and maybe memorable matchup in the last 20 years between these two teams? But first, is Quinyon Mitchell the Defensive Rookie of the Year? And is Saquon Barkley on track to win Offensive Player of the Year? And could both realistically happen in 2024. But first, this episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And to get started on today's episode of Locked On Eagles, we're talking the end of the season. Still got 3 months before we get there, but it's going to get here faster than we know it. And the reason why I brought this topic up was because we recorded our Locked On NFC Squad show yesterday, and you'll hear once you tune into that for your second listen of the day that we got into a discussion about, could anybody in the NFC potentially be the MVP? Right now it looks like the AFC has some front runners. You got Lamar Jackson, you got Josh Allen. Lou threw out that potentially Saquon makes a case of being the most likely non-quarterback to potentially battle for the MVP. Now, do I think that is likely to happen? Probably not, because it is a quarterback award, but it got me thinking just how likely, and this brought up a perfect Wednesday episode of the show, what's more likely, Saquon Barkley wins the Offensive Player of the Year, or Quinyon Mitchell, who we've been praising, wins the Defensive Rookie of the Year. And I'm glad that this episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, because I went over to FanDuel to look at the odds. And right now, if you look at it, the front runner for the Offensive Player of the Year is Derrick Henry. Warranted. If you look at his numbers right now, he's sitting at plus 100 on FanDuel with 141 touches at 6.6 yards per touch, with 935 yards from scrimmage and 10 total touchdowns. Saquon sits second at plus 330 over at FanDuel with 124 touches, 6.1 yards per touch, 761 yards per scrimmage, and 6 total touchdowns. Now, who won that award in 2023, you may ask? Christian McCaffrey. Think this is a very good comparison. We've brought up what Saquon does for this offense, and it's very Christian McCaffrey-esque. You can run the pass game, you can run the run game, they can do a lot for you. So if you look at his winning numbers from last year, he had 339 touches, which equated to 6 yards per touch. He had 2,023 yards from scrimmage and 21 total touchdowns. So now, could both Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley hit those numbers? Saquon's only through 6 games. If you averaged it out, he would still be a little short. Derrick Henry, though, on the other hand, he looks like he could hit that number the way that Baltimore is playing right now. So that brings me to the Defensive Rookie of the Year discussion. And I was looking, and I honestly was shocked by what FanDuel has currently as the odds on who is going to win Defensive Rookie of the Year. Right now, and you might think Quinyon Mitchell, if you're listening to the show, is the guy. He's sitting in third at plus 750. He's sitting right behind Laiatu Latu at plus 350 from the Colts, And Jared Verse is number 1 at plus 170 from the Rams. So I did some digging. I went and looked at who was the last defensive back to win Rookie of the Year and who was the last edge player to win Rookie of the Year. So last year, it was Will Anderson. His numbers, 7 sacks, 22 quarterback hits, 10 tackles for loss, 45 tackles, 0 forced fumbles. Right now, Jared Verse at plus 170 has 1 sack, 9 quarterback hits, 6 tackles for loss, 26 total tackles, and 1 forced fumble. Liatu Latu, he has 2 sacks, 5 quarterback hits, 2 tackles for loss, 14 total tackles, and 2 forced fumbles. The last cornerback to win Rookie of the Year, Sauce Gardner. His numbers, 20 pass deflections, 2 interceptions, 75 total tackles. Quinyon Mitchell currently, 6 passes defended. According to some books, it could be 7 or 8, depending where you're looking, and 25 total tackles. Now, what's more likely? I believe Quinyon Mitchell, with farther odds at plus 750, has a better chance to get closer to the rookie numbers of Sauce Gardner, which won him Defensive Rookie of the Year back in 2022, than Saquon Barkley can to keep up with Derrick Henry. Simply because I don't think Jared Verse and Latu are going to keep up with Will Anderson's pace, nor even touch his pace. But Quinyon Mitchell, those interceptions, Lou and I have talked about it, he should have 5 or 6 at this point. Those are going to come in bunches. Can he eclipse 2? I believe so. He's still got 11 games to do it. Without a doubt, he can do it. He's always around the football. Now, as good as Saquon has been, I think it'll probably come back to earth at some point where the production starts to level out in the middle somewhere between Saquon, between Devontae, between A.J. Brown. Whereas on the defensive side of the football, I still think you're going to see teams targeting Quinyon Mitchell a bit more with the way that Saquon has been playing, unless teams smarten up, or excuse me, not Saquon, Darius Slay on the other side has been playing, but teams should smarten up and not throw his way. But when you get into a game this week, when you got some really good wide receivers to go and defend, there's going to be times when he's lined up with Jamar Chase. They're going to throw the ball his way. Can he get his first interception against Cincinnati? We'll see. But I think he can eclipse those Sauce Gardner numbers. The tackles, he's on pace to eclipse. Pass defended, according to who is grading out, PFF or Pro Football Reference, he has between 6 and 8 right now. He just has to get the turnovers. Saquon, I don't think he can hit Christian McCaffrey touchdown numbers. Yardage, I still think he's like a 1,600 to 1,800 guy. I don't think he hits 2,000. But Quinyon Mitchell, he's in for a special rookie season right now. And you're probably saying there's only like 2 guys right now in that Offensive Player of the Year category that make a good case. I still think Derrick Henry is just he's the focal point of the Ravens offense, and they made that clear. I still don't trust Nick Sirianni and Kellen Moore to make Saquon the focal point until they show me otherwise. And still, you're going to get some touchdowns poached from Jalen Hurts, tush push, and they're going to still throw Kenny Gainwell in there at times, and Dallas Goedert will be back before you know it. I think there are a lot of mouths to feed in Philadelphia, where Baltimore, it's more everybody kind of eats in the wide receiver game, but Derrick Henry is going to get most of the buffet. You got 3 all-stars in Philadelphia that you have to feed. So when my brain breaks it down, I'm saying who and what is more likely. I'm going with Quinyon. I like the farther odds. I like you'll get more bang for your buck if you do go that route. And I still believe the interceptions are going to come. They have to come at some point. Quinyon Mitchell, Defensive Rookie of the Year. Saquon Barkley, Offensive Player of the Year. Por qué a las dos? Could we get both? That truly would be an off-season for Howie Roseman to remember if that were the case. But getting into something that's a little less memorable, let's take a look back at the last 5 matchups between the Bengals and the Eagles, because I clearly didn't remember a couple of them when I was looking back, and I'm sure you, the listener, don't remember many of them either. So let's look at maybe the most forgettable series between the Eagles and an AFC opponent. Stick with us as we continue on this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. This Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. If you want to get tickets to, let's say, an NBA event, NHL, NFL, or MLB, well, you quite literally can right now, because this is the sports equinox, the best time of the year. And there's only one place where I'm going to send you to get your tickets, and that is Game Time. And that's because they have a new feature called Game Time Picks, which makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. It filters out all the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. If you're not into sports, you can also go see live comedy shows. My wife loves seeing musicals. She loves to go to the Denver Performing Arts Center to see her theater, and she gets her tickets over at Game Time. And you can get your tickets to see a panoramic view from your seat even before you buy, and they have the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. All you have to do to take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. This episode is brought to you by our friends over at PrizePicks, where all you have to do is pick 2 to 6 players and say, are they going to have more or less than their Prize Picks projections? All it is you against PrizePicks, and you can get in on the action today and play alongside such individuals as Drewski, Joe Budden, former MMA champ Sugar Sean O'Malley. And PrizePicks puts its members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my picks hit, I can get my money in as quickly as 15 minutes. So sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. And you don't even need to win to get that $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks also offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday. Each Tuesday, PrizePicks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value for your lineup. So if you're watching the Eagles and the Bengals this weekend, you want to go heavy on the passing, say Joe Burrow is going to have more than his PrizePicks projection, as well as Jalen Hurts having more than his PrizePicks projection. Let's hope that Jalen Hurts has a little bit more than Burrow. But if you want to get in on the action today, download the app and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Welcome back, everyone, to this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Your host, Gino Camilleri, continuing on here, and we have to talk about this upcoming Sunday's matchup between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Cincinnati Bengals, which could potentially be, and probably is, after I list off some of these former battles between quarterbacks, the most exciting QB matchup in the series in the last 25 years. And every 4 years, you know that they rotate the AFC North, AFC East, South, West. You know how it works. This year, get to play the AFC North. And you think about all of these teams and games that you played against them in the past. I think the Baltimore Ravens, Donovan McNabb throws it to Ed Reed, who returns it 108 yards. Or you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Ben Roethlisberger game where they sacked him 7 times. And I believe that if they played him in the 2008-2009 Super Bowl, they beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. Or even look at the Browns, the first game of Carson Wentz, where that was their kind of coming out party for that team and what would be over the Doug Peterson regime. And speaking of Doug Peterson, this series was quite forgettable for him, and I think it was quite forgettable for Chip Kelly, and I think it was quite forgettable for Andy Reid as well, because the last time the Philadelphia Eagles have gotten a win in this series was 6 meetings ago, back on Christmas Eve, the year 2000, in a 16-7 win, not at Lincoln Financial Field, at the Vet, where Donovan McNabb outdueled Scott Mitchell 16-7. Oh, how forgettable that game was. I'm sure some of you who are older Eagles fans remembers that as one of the last games at the Vet. We all know what happened the following years to come at that stadium. We don't have to go down memory lane there. But since then, since the last win, the Eagles have 0 wins, 3 losses, and 2 ties against the Cincinnati Bengals. Now you're probably saying, I remember the 2 ties. Or you're probably saying, I at least remember the most recent one where Doug Peterson literally punted the season away, punting in overtime with about 7 seconds left, rather than trying to kick a field goal with Jake Elliott, who had been money from long range. Back in 2005, the Eagles lost by 28 points in a Week 17 game that really didn't matter at the time, because this game took place in the last week of the 2004 season, where the Eagles already had the number 1 seed locked up. So Coy Detmer and Jeff Blake went out there and battled against John Kitna. And if you could tell us who the only Eagle to catch a touchdown in that game was, I'll give you absolutely nothing. Just the joy of knowing this, that Freddie Mitchell was the only individual to catch a touchdown in that game. So then we move on to 2008, the famous Donovan McNabb tie game. Rather, he didn't know that ties existed. The Eagles tied 13-13, where Donovan McNabb and Ryan Fitzpatrick played in a game where Donovan McNabb said verbatim, "I've never played in a game that ended in a tie. I didn't even know ties were in the rule book." The famous quote from Donovan McNabb, one of the final games he played in Philadelphia. Oh, how forgettable that game was. And if you could remember who scored that touchdown, the only one for the Eagles in that game, you will also be awarded 0 points, but just the joy of being a complete Eagle sicko and knowing that it was LJ Smith. Move on to 2012, the last year of Andy Reid. Actually, I said Chip Kelly had a bad time against the Bengals. He lucked out. He didn't get to play the Bengals because they played him in 2012 and then again in 2016. In 2012, they lost 34-13, where Nick Foles threw a lowly touchdown to Riley Cooper, and that's when Andy Dalton was actually pretty good, and they went to multiple playoffs and never won anything, so good for them. Then on to 2016, Carson Wentz versus Andy Dalton. This is probably the most forgettable game of them all. I honestly did not recall this game ever happening. I think my memory just blanked it out. They lost 32-14. They didn't score a touchdown until Zach Ertz caught a receiving touchdown late in the third quarter. Darren Sproles scampered in for another touchdown after that. But just how forgettable are all of these games? And then the last one that I think everybody, and probably Doug Peterson, puts this one out of his memory more than anything, was the Wentz versus Burrow 23-23 tie, where, as I said prior, Doug Peterson punts the season away, didn't go for 2 when they score a touchdown with about 21 seconds left in that game. Instead, they kick an extra point, go to overtime, and that was inevitably the downfall of Doug Peterson. Andy Reid, that was his last season, 2012, in a horrific game against the Bengals with Nick Foles. Doug Peterson, the same thing. Nick Sirianni, I hope your fate is different, my friend. And I hope it's different because this game, it's going to be Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, class of 2020. The last time they played, Wentz was the guy. And in the discussion that Lou and I were having, and Lou even posed this question on YouTube to our community and over on Twitter, would you rather take Joe Burrow or Jalen Hurts currently? I'll tell you this, I'll take this version of Jalen Hurts over any of the quarterbacks I mentioned prior in any of those matchups, to say the least. McNabb in 2008 was his last rodeo. Even then, saying that you didn't know that a tie was in the rule book, the writing was on the wall there. But this game is going to be almost a mirror of offenses. You look at the two duos of wide receivers. They're currently tied for the most touchdowns, I believe, with 37 in total since the year 2022. Can Jalen Hurts sling the ball with Joe Burrow? Can Jalen Hurts sling the ball with Patrick Mahomes? Can he keep up with these top-end quarterbacks? He better do a better job than the last couple guys that did it against the Cincinnati Bengals. But this is going to be another one of those tests where you're thinking late into the playoffs, and you're thinking back to this game, and you're saying, did we find a way to beat the better quarterbacks when it mattered? And was it because our quarterback played to who he is, didn't turn the ball over, we ran the football well, our defense won it, or are we going to have to see him throw the ball 30 plus times against the guy who you know is going to throw the ball 25 to 30 plus times? How is this game going to play out? Hopefully it's a lot of points, because the last 2 weeks, this Eagles team played really bad offenses, which, yes, the defenses played excellent. They played to that level. They didn't play down to their opponent. But this week's a different test. This game, it's not going to have long-term repercussions on anybody, let's say, and might be a forgettable matchup in the grand scheme of how this season plays out, because it is an AFC test. But everybody who does that quarterback equation in the back of their mind, how did they do against the best? This is one of those games. And Lou and I, we started talking about that yesterday, but I'm going to wrap up the discussion here with some final points. Is Jalen Hurts, in this current version, good enough to get the job done? We might continue to see more examples of that this upcoming Sunday as the Eagles take on the Bengals. So don't go anywhere as we finish up this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. This Wednesday edition of LOE is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can get in on the action in the middle of this NFL season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get the hunch in the middle of the game, or heck, when you're listening to the Locked On Eagles podcast and you're saying, yeah, Quinyon Mitchell might be pretty good at plus 750 to win Defensive Rookie of the Year, or Saquon Barkley's odds might look a little too special for the Offensive Player of the Year, so you go and hammer that as well. You could check out the latest stats, live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And to get started today, you could get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you play your first $5 bet. All you have to do is go to FanDuel.com to get started today. All right, everyone, wrapping up this Wednesday edition of the show here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. And thank you for making us your first listen. And thank you for sticking with us here to finish up the show and to finish up yesterday's discussion. And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly recommend and you go and make it your second listen of the day. But essentially, Lou and I got into the age-old debate of a Philadelphia quarterback, and people took it one way, people took it another way. I think it got misconstrued in some ways, but essentially I wanted to boil down what the essence of the discussion was. I believe that Jalen Hurts currently, which is not the best version of Jalen Hurts we have ever seen, is still good enough to win with and win a Super Bowl with. Lou believes that the current version of Jalen Hurts that we are seeing is not good enough, and he is also not good enough and playing up to the $50 million contract that he signed. I think both points are valid. I think both sides of the argument are valid. I don't think extremes is where you deal in anything in life, and especially in sport. Sport is so much a science as it is an art, and I think it's probably more art than anything. And that's coming from somebody who's super duper analytical. That's my background, is numbers. And I still believe that there's an art to it. How do guys buy into each other? How do they respond to the coaches behind the scene? What are they doing off the... There's so much stuff that we're never going to really see from the outside looking in. But one thing I think we all can kind of see is that each team has one of these guys that we're evaluating week in and week out, and that is the quarterback. And essentially, the discussion is Jalen Hurts elite? And is he good enough to combat these elite guys? So let's break it down on a bell curve. So there's 32 quarterbacks, right? And if you break down a bell curve and split it in half, 16 will fall on one side, 16 will fall on the other. So if you're below the middle, you're probably below average, a marginal quarterback, adequate, maybe even poor. If you're on the right side of that bell curve, you're one of the 16 that is solid, good, great to elite. But on the bell curve, if you really boil it down at the extremes, at the ends, there's only a small sliver. And if you've never seen a bell curve, you can pull it up on Google right now while you're listening or watching along. And in that sliver, if you break down the numbers, out of 16 quarterbacks that fall into, let's say, the average to good category, only about 2 would be considered elite. And on the other side, only 2 would be considered poor. But then in the middle, which is about 96% of this bell curve, you are getting the marginal to adequate, to the average, to the above average, to the good, to the great. So in that above average to good to great section is 14 quarterbacks. Do you believe that Jalen Hurts, even though he might not fall into that 2 elite quarterback discussion, do you think he's above average, good, or great? That he's one of the 14 other quarterbacks that fall on the positive side of the bell curve? Even if he's not one of the 6 great to elite quarterbacks, because 4, if you broke it down percentage-wise, would be great. On the other side, 4 would be marginal. Even if he's not in the top 6, he's still one of the top 11 other guys. One of the top 10 other guys. Excuse me, I'm terrible at math. I'm so sorry. But essentially what I'm saying is Jalen Hurts is better than the average. Heck, I even think he falls into that good category. I would say he's still a top 10 to 12 quarterback in the NFL. And in reality, in the middle of that bell curve is where everybody else stands outside of the top 2 elite quarterbacks. And this year more than ever is probably the year that you can make the case for that. Because my side of the discussion, I was saying, outside of Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, is even Patrick Mahomes playing to an elite level, which is his highest level in his career? Absolutely not. Is Jared Goff playing to an elite level? I think he's very good right now, but I don't think he's elite. But if you don't believe that even with Jalen Hurts, who's still north of that 50% marker, probably closer to the great category than average, if you don't believe that he's worth the $50 million contract, which, by the way, currently is not even one of the top 5 quarterback contracts in terms of AAV per year. Every time a contract is signed, the value goes down and down. So you're saying in like 2 years, when CJ Stroud and some of these younger guys sign their extensions, that Jalen Hurts is going to get paid like the 16th best quarterback in football, and he's still performing like a top 16 guy. So it's all going to even out. It all is okay. The numbers match up. $50 million in terms of what a quarterback is getting paid is not that much right now. Daniel Jones is getting $40 million, which is currently number 16. That's a guy who's not playing to his spot on the bell curve. If Jalen Hurts was getting Dak Prescott money, I think this discussion would probably be a little bit more valid right now. If he was making $60 million and he was performing the way he was currently, that's not in the elite part of the bell curve. Heck, that's not even in the very good part of the bell curve where Dak is performing right now. But he's getting paid like the elite. Jalen is getting paid like a good to very good quarterback. And I still think he's performing like a good to very good quarterback. Pat Mahomes and Jordan Love are leading the league in turnovers right now in terms of interceptions. Do you think either of those teams want to get rid of their quarterback? No. Yes, Patrick Mahomes is probably close to that elite discussion on more days than not. But this year is a little bit different, right? I said this in our discussion that the Tom Brady, the Peyton Manning, the Roethlisberger, the Flat, like when there's like 5 to 6 guys that are elite, those days are gone. We thought we were going to see the torch passed. It just hasn't happened yet. People try to put Burrow in that discussion. I don't think it's there yet. I don't think he's like, Allen's a freak. Lamar's a freak. Like those guys have both done it and won it. And Joe has came close. Jalen has came close. But do you think Bengals fans are saying, let's get rid of Joe at his price? No. Because in reality, a large majority fall in the middle. I don't think Lou was wrong in what he was saying. I don't think anybody who believes that Jalen Hurts is underperforming is wrong in what they're saying. But at the same time, I still believe that he can win. That you can win with this version. When we're talking, is he a player you win in spite of, because, or with? You can win with a lot of players. You can't win in spite of your quarterback, but you can win with a lot of those guys. And that's where the bell curve falls, right in the middle. That's where a large majority of players in the NFL fall. There's few very good to elite. There's a lot of guys that are solid, average, good. And then there's a few that are very bad. A lot of people fall in the middle. And at quarterback, it's the same exact thing. Don't get lost in the extremes. Find the middle ground in this discussion. And if you want to continue to hear about this discussion and more on the Eagles and Bengals matchup, tune into tomorrow's episode of the show where Lou will be joined by the fellas over at Locked On Bengals. On Friday, we'll be back, of course, with LOE3, giving you 6 player props from FanDuel. We'll look in one more final time at the game. But as of now, that'll do it for me, Gino Camilleri, here, your host of the Locked On Eagles podcast. And I thank you for making us your first listen of the day. And for your second listen, go make sure you check out the new Locked On NFL with 2 shows each and every day. The first with the madman, Tyler Rowland. He gives you a double shot of NFL espresso in the morning. And then in the evening, stop by with the barber, Tony Wiggins, for some real NFL talk. Find Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. As always, please subscribe. Spread the message of Locked On Eagles. Go make sure you check us out on Twitter at DiBiaseLOE, at GC24_football, and at Locked On Birds. Make sure you subscribe to all of the Philadelphia Locked On shows, Phillies, Flyers, Sixers, Eagles. And I'm going to end this show as I always do. Fly, Eagles, fly.